There will be a chance for question and answers with all of the speakers after this session, but the purpose of this next session is really to get to the heart of that transformational change that's going to happen across the aged care, disability and mental health sectors, and what are some of the opportunities and the challenges that may come up in the move to consumer-directed care. So I'll introduce our panel. First we have Sue Hendy, who is the CEO of COTA. Sue has spent almost 4 decades at the forefront of the fight for a better go for older Australians in what she jokingly refers to her 38-year apprenticeship in ageing. Sue has attended the United Nations Open-Ended Working Group to examine the rights of older people, is a member of the Global Alliance on the Rights of Older People, and the current chair of the Global Alliance on the Rights of Older People. And she's also the Vice President of the International Federation of Ageing. David, who's sitting next to me, leads the Victorian team for the National Disability Service. NDS provides high-quality information and support to NDS member organisations in relation to service delivery, management, governance and operations. David's diverse career commenced as a lawyer, we won't hold that against him, and as a salaried partner at the national plaintiff law firm Slater and Gordon Lawyers. And from early 2011, David worked at the Department of Premier and Cabinet Victoria as Assistant Director NDI Secretariat. So you've got a lot of knowledge, I'm sure. Next on the panel, we've got Irene Bouzo, who is started working at the Ethnic Community Councils of Victoria in 2008 and has worked as a Senior Policy Advisor and Aged Care Policy Officer. She's current Executive Officer. Some of the key areas Irene has worked on include looking at the issue of employment for Victorians from culturally diverse backgrounds and the preservation of the Racial Discrimination Act, to name a few. And in case you're not aware, Irene's on the end here. Sorry, I'm not doing it in very good order. Debra Parnell is Policy and Communications Manager at VICSERV. Debra joined VICSERV with extensive skills and experience in policy development, consultation engagement at a local, state and national level. Sue previously worked at COTA, Victoria, in the position of Manager of the Policy Unit, and has also worked at Alzheimer's Australia and the State Government Department of Human Services. So Debra has a focus on enabling people to be active participants in their communities regardless of their health and disability or social situation. And Carolyn, I don't have a bio for you here, so I'm going to have to get you to introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your role. So if you could kick off a little bit about, here it is. So Carolyn began her caring career 25 years ago as a nurse and has worked in health and various roles in the UK, Hong Kong and Australia. Her experiences included clinical care, operational and strategic planning and senior management roles. So Carolyn has a master's degree in health services, majoring in research methods, and remains passionate about inquiry and evidence-based practice. So I think you'll agree that we've got a very well-credentialed panel here. So I guess to kick off this panel session, I'm going to ask Sue to kick off and talk a little bit, because we've heard a lot about the NDIS, but we haven't heard as much about the aged care reforms. So I'm going to get Sue to give a little bit of an overview of what's coming in the aged care sector, but also what some of those opportunities might be. So Sue?
How many days have we got? I guess the aged care reform, as it's now known, or living longer, living better, as it was formerly known, is the hugest change that I've seen in ageing, in policy and program. So it's rolling together I mean, those of you who work in this sector have got the overview, so I won't trail too much into that. But it is now rolling together everything that we've known from community care through to residential care, and I think there were something like 75 funding streams now being rolled into pretty much the same thing, and separating out the funding that used to be in the HAC program that was for people with disabilities who were under 65. So we've now got this program that used to be run in Victoria. Feds used to set the high level, fund the state put it in some money. They used to fund a whole lot of people, including local government, who put in extra money. Now, with it rolling back up to the federal level, the federal government is going to set the policy, set the budget and decide who does what. Is that a good model? What we're seeing is that because Victoria stood out from the discussions for a long time, because we believed in Victoria we had the best model. Whether that's true or not, that was our belief, and we had a lot to lose, and I think that is true. So standing out of those negotiations, in a sense, has meant the discussions and the negotiations and developments, if they be that, are going on in the rest of the country, and we're not particularly involved in those at a programmatic level. Certainly the state government bureaucrats have been doing a fabulous job, and those working with them, they've been trying to get the best of Victoria inserted into whatever happens next. Yet to be seen. There's a sense that there's a lot going to happen and there is a lot happening, but at the same time nothing's happening. So there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of inaction. Is that a summary?
That sounds good.
However, there has been a couple of fact sheets, as they're told us to be. One's gone to funded organisations and one's gone to people who receive HACC and community care services and their carers. Have people received them yet? If you haven't, we could send these out. They are public documents, and they basically set the dates for what is and isn't happening. So nothing's happening now until the 1st of July 2016, and then in those next 3 years, nothing will happen apart from the tendering might start, is what these suggest. Now, I think it's probably going to move quicker than that. What we're seeing in other states is that, for instance, in New South Wales, there's been a set of services for the state allocated to one provider. Now, in Victoria, we have some 300 or more HACC providers. In the ethnic communities sector, we would have 50, if not more. So what's going to happen? So you can see that a whole lot of people are going, and I know in some of the smaller, I mean, we're HACC funded and VATCHO, and there's a number of people in the room who've come up to me and says, you know, we have $90,000 or we have this or we have that. It's unlikely that will be the future, because that's not what we're seeing in the rest of the country. We're seeing 1 or 2 or 3 providers per state being allocated the main resource. So I think there are significant changes on the horizon if that's how Victoria goes, and I can't see how we would not be part of that. So I guess the question then becomes, how do we ensure that the best of what we do, and we think we do a lot of good stuff in Victoria compared, you know, because there's been so many agencies involved, there has been some fabulous work. The opportunities, though, is that, in a sense, in the past, some programs have said, well, because it's been constrained by the funding program, what we can offer you under the HACC program is this lot. And if that's not what you want, well, I'm sorry, you don't get anything else. Whereas now, consumer-directed care would tell you, as with the discussions around NDS, etc., is that it's consumer-driven. So what is it that would help me stay at home with all my chronic illness, my health issues, or whatever it might be? What would help me? Now, how long's the list? And that's the thing that then confronts older people who are becoming their own employer, the employer of their service, for a service they're not sure what they're allowed to have. So there's that developmental aspect of people becoming their own advocates, and we heard earlier the stories about, you know, yes or no, but hang on, you told me I could have that and now you're telling me I can't, and how do I be my advocate when I'm not feeling particularly well and upright? So choices exist, and that's fabulous, because in some cases what people wanted before under the HACC system they couldn't get. So we're in this two-sided system of going, it's going to be great, but.
Thank you, and I can see why that project's not fully fleshed out as yet. Look, I might segue over to Irene, just given ECCV's role in the aged care space, from your perspective around what you think the opportunities are, particularly thinking about culturally and linguistically diverse communities and individuals.
Thanks very much, Mary. Ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues. Look, Ethnic Communities Council of Victoria is the peak advocacy body for ethnic and multicultural organisations in Victoria, and it's a privilege here to be speaking on their behalf. I worked for the 5 years as a policy advocate in aged care, so about 38% of people over the age of 65 are from a culturally diverse background, and that is expected to increase, which means people are likely to come across every second or third consumer will be from a non-English speaking background if you're in the aged care area. Look, the biggest opportunities of the consumer-directed care reforms, we did some research with Monash University, and the findings told us that culturally diverse seniors want to stay living at home as long as possible. Not a surprise, but it's verified by evidence-based research, and also they have a specific, distinct preference for ethno-specific services. So the consumer-directed care reforms ideally would offer called consumers more flexibility to actually seek out their preferred services, which would often be ethno-specific services in an ideal world. Good timing at this point, I have to mention, ECCV has transitioned its popular multicultural aged care directory to an online website. We've only just done that. It's a great resource, and we call the website the MaxD website. That, when it was a hard copy, 500 copies used to disappear within 2 weeks. So resources are there. Victoria has a great network of ethnic aged care providers. I mentioned a figure of 50. We've actually got 200 ethnic and multicultural community-based organisations are members of ECCV, and a great number of those have been delivering culturally responsive aged care, disability, mental health services, all kinds of services that hit the mark with people from culturally diverse backgrounds. Some have been doing it for 40 years, some more than 40 years. We hope there'll be an opportunity for those agencies to maybe more actively broker and subcontract their services, maybe find new collaborative, innovative, flexible business models. The biggest challenges for the ethnic and multicultural organisations with the consumer-directed care reforms. Look, the ethnic and multicultural organisations cater for vulnerable and disadvantaged culturally diverse consumers, people with complex needs. It's more costly, it takes more intensive resources to deal with these people, repeated visits, repeated consultations. Also, the new market-driven funding model that we're all faced with, we've already seen the impact of the decline of upfront government funding. Some of those ethnic and multicultural organisations are going to find it hard to remain financially viable because they don't have cash reserves when you depend on upfront government funding. So this is an issue. How do we keep this expertise in the sector if people have a preference and a choice for those services? In the one-size-fits-all consumer-directed care funding model, those organisations that cater for a higher proportion of vulnerable and disadvantaged clients will actually struggle with financial viability. They actually need new business models. If those organisations are destabilised, the consumers will not actually find that ideal world of more choice, easier access, better care. The consumers, Gabby, I have to thank you for putting the point of view earlier of the called consumers. Called consumers have, in many families, low English literacy, distrust of authority due to their, various migration experiences, lack of informal support, don't understand consumer-directed care, and are not adapting well to change. So we really have to see the picture.
So I'm hearing a common theme, and Matthew mentioned in the panel around organisations that we're not becoming generic organisations that don't meet our specific needs. So I think you've highlighted that as well. Deb, I might hand to you in terms of your organisations you represent, which is predominantly in the mental health field, around what some of the opportunities and challenges facing the mental health sector are in the coming years.
Thanks. It is a really interesting space for people with mental illness and mental health services, as we're facing the full implementation of NDIS and as we've been through the trial of NDIS in Barwon. People with mental illness and the approach to working with people with mental illness has been quite complex. And in fact, even at this stage, while we know what the rollout of NDIS across the state is going to, how that is going to happen, there is still a lot of unanswered questions about what the support for people with mental illness will look like under NDIS. In Victoria, we are in a further more complex situation because under the previous state government, they committed all the existing, or almost all the existing, PDRSS, which was the previous state-funded mental health, community mental health program. In Barwon, they committed all those funds into the NDIS. So for the last 18 months in Barwon, there has been no state-funded community managed mental health services operating outside NDIS. So we have a very unusual situation in Barwon that makes it very difficult to understand what NDIS will actually look like for people with mental illness. We still don't know, in fact, what the implementation of NDIS will look like for people with mental illness into the future, because a lot of work is still being done at the national level to actually determine what supports for people with mental illness will look like under NDIS. And we are still waiting for the state government to tell us what supports will be available for people with mental illness across the state once the NDIS starts to roll out. So we're sort of in this very unusual where we're almost facing a bit of a black hole. We know some of the answers, but there are a lot that is still unknown. Now, person-centred and recovery-oriented practice has been a cornerstone of community mental health services probably for the last 25 years. And really, this move into NDIS and the reshaping of mental health services is perhaps the most significant innovation in mental health since deinstitutionalisation. So that has been a strong component in existing services. And what an approach of consumer-led orientation can mean for consumers in mental health services. I think, you know, in some ways it can be huge. It is a significant human rights approach that I think is, you know, at this point in time is really significant to be able to put the human rights of people with mental illness central into the service system. But there is still a lot of difficulty in knowing how that is going to play out in the service, in the way services are provided. We think that, in fact, this consumer-led orientation has the potential of reframing how people with mental illness are viewed in our community. Really, it enables people with mental illness to take so much more control, to really have a lot more autonomy and independence as they are receiving mental health services. We see that there's the potential for new ways of working, for services to be more responsive, to be more innovative, and hopefully be less constrained around the way services are funded and the models that are existing. I think it's important also to see that the potential is not just for in care settings, but it's actually across the whole service system and in effect right across the community, to be able to break down that stigma and discrimination that people are experiencing every day. I think some of the experience of Barwon has been very indicative, and we've actually done a piece of work in Barwon over the last 12 months, and a report's on the table down there, our orange banner, which doesn't say VICSERV at the top but says networks. That's actually us. But we have got a copy of the report we did there, which I think does give us a lot of indication about how the experience of the NDIS trial has impacted on people with mental illness, their families and carers and services. But some of the things that are coming out of Barwon is showing us that people now, in the later iteration, I guess, of how NDIS is starting to develop, that in fact it is proving to be a really fantastic way of people having much more control about their services, that services are seeing there is a lot more collaboration between the providers and the people they're working with, and that we also see the potential, in particular, for peer workers, which have been a very strong component of the mental health sector. And this can really, I think, under a consumer-led orientation, and I think, you know, we may not talk so much about a consumer-directed care orientation, which has, I think, comes from a much more of a care orientation than mental health is used to talking about. But consumer-led has that real potential for a growth in the peer workforce and much greater collaboration, not only in service delivery, but in service design and co-production around design. So I think there are enormous opportunities, but with all those, there are challenges.
Absolutely, and I think we were reminded by our panel around how it's participation in the community, in employment, in whole aspects of people's lives that is the aspiration for these moves to consumer-led service delivery. It's around being able to meaningfully participate in life in all its forms.
That's right, exactly.
David, I'll hand to you. NDS, as the peak body for the disability services sector, will be faced by a lot of challenges and opportunities over the next couple of years, which I'm sure your members are talking to you about. Perhaps if you could talk about those as well.
Challenges and opportunities?
Yep.
Okay. Yes, it's fair to say that our members are living with clients in the Barwon area, the experience of the NDIS. They're also living it in the other 6, or now 7 trial sites around Australia. It's fair to say that what the NDIS experience is throwing up in terms of consumer-driven outcomes is presenting both challenges and opportunities for people with disability. As Deb has already alluded to. In terms of, perhaps to deal with the opportunities first of all, in terms of the disability sector, as I think Matthew alluded to at the start, and certainly I think Gabby did as well, the Disability Support Register in Victoria continues to grow. Under an NDIS, the DSR will no longer exist. In Victoria and in every other state and territory, in terms of the opportunity to deliver real and tangible outcomes supporting people with disability, the DSR will disappear. We'll move from a ration system of disability supports to one which is about entitlements, delivering to individuals what they need as part of their plans. And certainly from our point of view, we think that should be a fantastic thing once the full vision of the NDIS is realised. We also think it's fantastic that if not the drive for consumer-driven services is the reason for this, we think it's great that the NDIS promises or holds out the prospect of a 300% increase in funding for disability services. By definition, you would jolly well hope that with that sort of funding increase, significant, sustainable improvements in the economic and social outcomes that people with disability want are capable of being delivered through the NDIS. We think that another opportunity that presents itself is that people with disability who are clients of the scheme will not have to go through the, in my humble opinion, the insulting process, having established an eligibility in one state, having to re-establish their eligibility to access disability services if they choose to do what anyone else in the community wants to do and move house, which is the current case that we have in Australia at the moment. Under an NDIS, supports will be portable, and we think that in terms of that focus on a consumer-driven approach to the delivery of services, that's also an excellent promised outcome. I don't say it's been realised because the NDIS full scheme has transition hasn't even commenced yet, but certainly the promise of the NDIS in that space is really fantastic from our point of view. Equally, we think that the NDIS and its focus on consumer-driven outcomes represents the hope, certainly from the point of view of our organisation, of moving from a more paternalistic health and care model in the provision of disability supports and one which is capable of delivering community inclusion and integration for people with disability. certainly there are still, I mean, in my travels meeting our members, it's still fair to say that many of our members continue to express understandable frustrations that current models of training in the sector assume that a disability support worker is there to provide care and health outcomes, when in fact better and, well, in fact good practice would suggest that under an NDIS what our sector will be able to focus upon is delivering community integration and inclusion outcomes. And certainly the promise of the NDIS is strong in that space. In terms of the challenges, and they are many, it's fair to say, one of the challenges I think we think that is represented by consumer-driven care is understanding with some clarity what government intends to do about it. In the disability sector, for example, there are 4,500 disability support workers in Victoria directly employed by government, together with a significant cohort of back-of-house staff. In terms of the challenges of the NDIS, there's a challenge for the Victorian government and indeed other governments, with the possible exception of New South Wales, as to how they are going to respond to the fact that the NDIS is in town and that disability supports and the prices for those supports may present challenges for government in terms of staying in the business of the provision of disability services. Another challenge, lest you need to be reminded, for the sector is the pace of change. It's fair to say that the NDIS, from the time it was endorsed by COAG as a scheme to the time it was rolled out as a trial, spanned a period of development of about 12 to 16 months. That's a very short time frame for a scheme which I think on any assessment represents probably, almost certainly one of the most significant social policy initiatives in Australia's history. So there's going to be teething problems, and dealing with those teething problems as full scheme rolls out is going to be a significant challenge. Then there's a whole suite of known unknowns in the NDIS, some of which Deb's already alluded to, but very quickly, we don't have clarity yet as to what role the NDIA will play, the National Disability Insurance Agency will play, in terms of the management of the market for disability services. Will, for example, the agency do as it's said in various public fora and play a role of facilitating and monitoring the new market for disability services? And you may well ask, as I do, what exactly that means. Or will it play a more interventionist role, particularly in the early years of the scheme, to ensure that rogue market behaviour doesn't actually produce outcomes which are adverse to the needs of people with disability, their families and carers? And I should say, I'm not even talking in a parochial, not-for-profit versus for-profit sector sense. From my point of view and the point of view of my organisation, what's important is not that the market simply preserve the status quo in terms of who's providing the services, but that the market deliver tangible and ongoing outcomes for people with disability. That's the reality of customer-driven support. But that said, when asked the question, and we sometimes do, as to what will be done in the event that a large provider of whatever status comes into the market and decides to start running loss leaders, when asked the question as to how the scheme will respond, we're looking forward to receiving a very concrete answer. And I think, to be quite frank, the sector is entitled to one. We've got consent. Sorry, Mary, am I going on too long? I do apologise.
I will have to get to some of the other panellists, but I guess some common themes that I'm already starting to hear is around safeguarding of human rights, and that this move really needs to ensure that human rights are safeguarded, and the onus is really on us as peak bodies to really keep advocating that human rights are upheld, and that this system does lead to better lives, not more hardship, as we've heard in Kylie's case. So I'll hand over to you, Carolyn, to quickly talk about the opportunities and challenges for carers, and also aware that Sue didn't have a chance to talk about some of the challenges for the aged care sector. So Carolyn, I'll get you to kick off just with the carers sector around what you see the opportunities and challenges.
Okay, thanks, Mary. I think many of the opportunities also become challenges for carers, and so I'm going to start with the challenges first so that I can end on an optimistic note. Carers are telling us that the major concern that they have is managing a budget. Many carers are aged and have never really had to do any of this planning or assessment advocacy in their own right. And so they really don't want to have to manage a budget, and they don't want to become insurance brokers or employers. And that's what they're going to have to do under consumer-directed care. So they're feeling overwhelmed not only in their caring role, but they're feeling more overwhelmed by the change that's about to happen. And so we just need to continue to educate, communicate, and build capacity within the caring community. Another one is that in this person-centric reform that we're seeing, carers are being left out. And whilst the dollar's finite, budgets will always be pushed towards people who need care needs, and that's exactly what we've advocated for, choice and control around service provision. But I think the government in particular have forgotten that carers are underpinning the service sector and often doing it hard on their own. So balancing the needs of carers with the care recipient is another fear and another challenge I think that we've got ahead of us. I think being accountable, I've mentioned budgets, acquittals, employment, navigating the system, already feeling isolated, alone and unable to take on this extra role. And then having the confidence not just to advocate for the person that they're caring for, but also for themselves. Which takes me again, the flip side of that obviously is that there's major opportunities there for carers. So yes, they're going to have much more control and autonomy over the funding that's allocated to their family, including flexibility, choice of services and the workers that they use. They're not going to have to pay a case manager because they'll be case managing themselves, and so there'll be a little bit more dollar to go towards services and supports. And they will have the opportunity to learn more about services and choose those services. They can build up their confidence and the trust that families are obviously wanting, but also building in that way their own confidence in their own decisions. So I think it's tainted, but I think there's more opportunities than there are challenges.
And Sue, did you want to add anything?
Well, I think it's really interesting, and you're probably seeing it like the rest of us up here in a sense. 3 different areas, 3 major reforms, all very similar but at different time frames in a sense, and different parts of our community, but we're all part of the broader part of communities. So older people can also have a mental illness, can be a disability, maybe a carer, maybe caring for, so in a sense all of this is going on around us, and all of the challenges that we're speaking about are confronting all the sectors in a sense, but some of the sector areas have been able to get further down the track and understand it and move it and develop it and reinforce it and get the best out of it. And I think that's what I think's been fabulous about this panel. So I'm not answering a question, but I'm going where I want to go. Because I think it's really fabulous that state trustees have supported the panel and that we've had the opportunity to learn and share from each other and bring together something like this. Because I'm sitting here going, oh yes, I've got to write that down. Oh yeah. But I think one of the things, Deb, you picked it up in terms of the consumer-led and peer workforce, and it's linking that to the elements of diversity. The people we're talking about, it's bad language, but are so diverse. Older people are absolutely poor and wealthy and come from all sorts of backgrounds and have all sorts of skills, but are often judged to be incapable, unable to make a decision, don't have the capacity to make those decisions for themselves and need care. So I think learning that new language and focusing on the rights and getting rid of ageism and giving people, or understanding they have capacity, but when they don't have some capacity, they need support, and what does that look like so that we enable them to make their decisions for themselves instead of saying, we're the big brother and we look after you. So I think coming back to the concerns, it's around that sort of care element and ageism. But the consumer-led and peer workforce co-production are the things I think we need to be focusing on. But market failure is something that really concerns me at the moment. And I've heard that, in the new services around older people may be referred somewhere, but that person doesn't have to pick them up. What does that mean? So I might live on the border somewhere and it's too expensive to service me, so no one will. So what happens to me? So, you know, there are some market failure things I think that are sitting there that we need to look at, but at the same time, huge opportunities for older people and the community at large.